Well, thanks for tuning in. We're going to pick up in our Wednesday night series in First Kings that we had begun several weeks ago, and of course we've been kind of absentee for a couple of weeks here, and I haven't posted anything in regard to this particular study, and I'd like to continue with that in First Kings chapter 3. So that's where we're going to pick up more or less, actually in chapter 2 to begin with, because, as is typical in a Wednesday night study, we kind of go until our time is up, and then where we end, it might be in the middle of the chapter, it might be, a cleaner break for the next class. But in our last study, we left off towards the end of chapter 2, I think, and there was just a couple of points that I wanted to make before we moved forward into chapter 3. And we had previously talked about, on this first point, nowhere to run, and how after David gives this charge to his son Solomon to be faithful and to conduct himself righteously, and we studied that, and then David also gives some political, you might even militaristic kind of advice. He names 3 individuals in particular that he knows are going to cause Solomon trouble, because remember at the beginning of Solomon's reign, David's other son Adonijah, tried to do as Absalom did and crown himself king, and ultimately that falls apart. David hears about it, and then, Solomon is anointed and takes the throne and becomes king. But there were individuals from David's court that had been previously faithful to David who ended up joining Adonijah. And one of those was Joab, who had been, at least at some points in his life, fiercely loyal to David. Another was Shimei, who was originally loyal to Saul. Then remember, he's the guy who along the road, as David is being exiled and he's walking into the wilderness, he's throwing rocks at David and he's cussing at him and so on and so forth, and then later repents and David accepts him. But now David believes Shimei is going to be causing Solomon trouble, and so David recommends to Solomon the execution of those individuals. And Adonijah is also eventually executed. Solomon gives terms to these guys to save themselves. It was different for each individual, but they ultimately end up breaking those terms, and so Solomon has them executed. And there was just nowhere for them to run. And we took from that point, or those incidents, that the same is true in a spiritual sense for all people, that ultimately we're all going to be held accountable before the judge, the king, and he is going to judge us according to our deeds. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, "We must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad." And it's also true that all stand alone before God. And near the end of 1 Kings chapter 2, in verse 33, you see that Solomon here, after the course of these executions, or during the course of these executions, specifically after Joab is executed, he says, "Their blood shall return on the head of Joab." And he's talking about, all the individuals whom Joab had betrayed previously, like Abner and I forget who else now, but he betrayed David's orders a number of different times. Abner was certainly one of them, and Amasa, I think, was the other whom David appointed in Joab's place to be commander of the army, and then Joab just murdered him on the way to a battle somewhere. And so Solomon is saying the Lord is going to return his blood on his own head, because he fell upon men more righteous and better than he, and he killed them with the sword, while my father David did not know it. And then there it is in verse 32, Solomon mentions Abner and Amasa specifically. And then verse 33, "So shall their blood return on the head of Joab and on the head of his descendants forever. But to David and his descendants and his house and his throne may there be peace from the Lord forever." So you might be wondering, well, in what way does that pertain to this point, that all men stand alone before God? Well, I think it's significant to point out that, Solomon is seizing upon this promise made to David, right, in 2 Samuel 7, about his descendants remaining forever on his throne. But that was contingent upon their obedience. So Solomon doesn't name that explicitly there in that text, as he's, seizing upon that promise and reiterating that promise. But if you go back to the earlier in the chapter, where Solomon is, where David is speaking to Solomon, if you look at David's words, and he's giving this charge in verses 3 and 4, he says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, his statutes, his commandments, ordinances. And then notice he says, so that, in verse 4, the Lord may carry out his promise which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful of their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So David understood that, yes, this was a tremendous and great promise from God, but it was also the blessings that were to come were conditional upon these men, and of course the behavior of these men and their faithfulness. And the vast majority of them, though they were descended from David, were not faithful. They were idolatrous, and it gets to a point where they're just lasting a matter of days or weeks on the throne, and they're just murdering one another left and right. So I think that the lesson for us is that we're all going to be held accountable as individuals before God, and He has written out these great promises in His Word for us. But even Solomon and David understood that this wasn't going to happen by default. And as Ezekiel teaches, the soul that sins shall die. And in Romans 14:12, each man must give an account of himself before the Lord. This passage in 2 Chronicles 16:9 says that the Lord is looking throughout the earth, seeking whose heart is loyal to Him. And so we all stand alone before God. My dad's faithfulness or unfaithfulness can have some indirect influences on me. The same is true of anybody, not just, I single out my dad because of the context here. It could be, our parents, our moms, or grandparents. Their faithfulness or unfaithfulness is going to have some sort of influence upon us. But ultimately, my accountability to God is not going to be affected by what somebody else does. It's going to be affected by what I do. Right? I'm going to be judged according to the deeds that I have done. And so we, again, stand before God as individuals, and we can expect to receive His promise only in the promise of blessing insofar as we are faithful to Him. And David understood this. He knew that it was only going to be true insofar as his descendants followed the Lord. But the positive side is, the good, the hopeful thing about that is that our eternal destiny, it's not determined by our parents, and it's not determined by our grandparents, but your current standing with God. And my destiny is determined by my current standing with God. And so I think that that's a point worth reinforcing here, because David reinforced it to Solomon. If you and your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth, then you're not going to lack somebody on the throne of Israel. And it's shortly right. It's right after Solomon. It's his son Rehoboam who acts foolishly, and then the kingdom ends up getting divided, and it's just really all downhill from there. And so that takes us into chapter 3, and this is going to be our first point regarding marriage here. And we'll probably come back to this point again and revisit it when we get to chapter 11. And we're going to look at some things in this discussion with regard to marriage. But let's just read 1 Kings chapter 3 and the first few verses here, like the first 3 verses. So this is 1 Kings 3, verses 1 through 3. Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. And the people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So let's start with this first note that's made here in chapter 3. So, following chapter 2, David's enemies are dealt with, and Solomon is his power has been consolidated. He's on the throne. If you look at the very last verse of chapter 2, in fact, it says, "Thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon." And the next thing he goes about doing here is he's getting this marriage alliance. He formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, And he took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David. Now, I guess as I read that, I wonder why, and maybe you have the same question too, why it is that Solomon was allowed to take a foreign wife, a Gentile wife, instead of marry one of the faithful Hebrew women. But I think that there is a foreshadowing here in this text of what ultimately becomes Solomon's downfall. Right? Because as I mentioned, when we get to chapter 11, verse 4 in particular says that when Solomon was old, his wives, plural, and he had many of them, hundreds, led his heart astray from the Lord. But this pattern that we read in, or I guess I should say, the outcome that we see in 1 Kings 11, where Solomon's multiple wives lead his heart astray, begins back here in chapter 3, because he's taking this foreign wife, this unbeliever, and this Egyptian princess, because it made political sense, right? That's what the text is saying. He's forming a marriage alliance, and those, marriage to fellow royalty was a political strategy in the ancient world, and a lot of times conflict between nations was avoided for the sake of family ties, is what it boiled down to. And so this is why Solomon is doing this. And people today still marry because it makes economic sense, or because it makes social sense, or I guess even because it makes political sense, as it did for Solomon. But this is not the reason anyone should get married, because you think a man or woman is the key to your financial future, or will provide you with some other kind of security, or you're scared of being alone, or just because you're going to settle for whoever comes along. None of these are acceptable biblical reasons to marry anybody. We have to ask ourselves, are we primarily concerned with how much we can get out of relationships physically or financially, or are we most concerned with how well the two of us are going to serve God together? And that's the thing that Solomon completely bypasses from the beginning, right? And we see where it takes him. Ultimately, at the end of his life, he becomes a fool, and he's just entrenched in idolatry, and it's sad. But it's a warning to us. Marriage is to be God-centered, and thus it is to be a God-glorifying institution. And that's what he intended it to be. If you look in passages such as 1 Peter 3:7 and Malachi chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, let's read those texts together. So I'm going to turn over to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 into the New Testament. And, you'll recognize this text where he's giving instructions to wives, first off. But then he has something to say about marriage in general, and how the husband and wife should view one another. So this is 1 Peter chapter 3 in verse 7. He says, "You husbands in the same way live with your wives in an understanding way as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor listen to this. This is the part that I turn here for. As a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered." So it's that little phrase that Peter uses there, that husband and wife who are faithfully serving God, they're fellow heirs of the blessing, of the promise of God, the grace of life, is what the New American Standard says. And so it's to be a God glorifying institution, God centered, and we see one another as helping each other get to heaven. We don't want to be disqualified as heirs. We want to remain that identity. And we want to pursue that common identity together as fellow heirs of the grace of life. And so it's not for social or political or emotional reasons primarily. There's certainly some benefits that come in that regard, material benefits and physical ones that are to be enjoyed in the marriage relationship. But marriage is not primarily for those things. And now let's go to Malachi chapter 2. Malachi. So last book of the Old Testament here. in Malachi chapter 2, and this prophet is indicting the people for a lot of different things, and one of them is their treatment of their spouses, and this kind of capricious divorce. Now, the old law allowed for that, as Jesus teaches in Matthew 19, that because of the hardness of people's hearts, Moses permitted men to divorce their wives. But he says from the beginning it was not so, and so I mentioned that just to kind of get the divine perspective from the beginning. What God's intention was from the beginning was one man, one woman together for life, until death separated them. And so, with that in mind, we go to Malachi chapter 2, and we look at verses 13 through 16. So this is another thing you do. Malachi says, "You cover the altar of the Lord with tears and weeping and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. But not one who has done so, who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did the one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth." And so you can get the general gist of that passage and the betrayals apparently that were going on between spouses, and again the emphasis of marriage being a covenant before God. But in verse 15, the New American Standard words it kind of awkwardly, I think, compared to other English translations. But if you're reading from the ESV or perhaps another English translation, it'll say, "What was the one seeking in this arrangement?" And that is godly offspring. And I think that is the an acceptable interpretation or translation, I should say, that makes more sense than how the New American Standard has worded it here. And I mention that because God made marriage, at least in part, because he is seeking godly offspring. So again, that points us back to that original focus for marriage, intention for marriage, that it's to be God-centered, God-glorifying, a husband and wife, spiritually helping one another first and foremost, be servants of God, and continue to be heirs of his grace, and then also raise children who have the same intention. Now, this is not a command, and by that I mean, in order for a marriage to be acceptable to God, it has to produce children. That's not what I'm saying at all. But in the event that children are produced in marriage, just as they very well can be, and that's a pleasing thing to God. If that is the case, then he wants that offspring to be godly. He's seeking godly offspring. He's looking for our children to become disciples, right? And then enter into their own God-centered, God-glorifying marriages, right? And so on and so forth. But the reason that this, I think, point is made in this particular passage, because God is, he's addressing the issue of treachery and betrayal and divorce, and in particular, if you keep reading to verse 16, he says, "I hate divorce," says the Lord God of Israel. He's making the point that the godly offspring can only happen when both parents remain faithful to their marriage vows. First of all, remain faithful to the Lord, but doing so entails remaining faithful to your spouse and to the vows and to the covenant that you made before God, so that the children, the offspring, can be given the security which provides the basis for godly living. Right, so that you have this school. The family is a school in which the ways of the Lord are taught, and that family has to remain intact. In other words, and it begins with mom and dad focusing on God and wanting to serve God and love God first and foremost. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. Notice some of these passages that speak to parents' responsibility. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8 says, "Listen, my son, to your father's command, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." And again, that's repeated in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 20. And then in Proverbs 23:22, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. So again, the family was intended to be the school in which God's way of life is learned and practiced. And so we want our children to embrace the faith, but we should be modeling that faith for them in our marriage. And they should see a mom and dad who love God first and foremost, and prioritize Him, and are seeking His kingdom first. And we also have to realize that an ungodly marriage, where words and actions of mom and dad don't reflect the holiness of God or a love for God, that marriage is going to be an obstacle to our children becoming faithful Christians. In other words, what was true in Malachi's time, in Malachi chapter 2, is still true today. Right? Those spouses dealing treacherously with one another had an effect on their children. And so Solomon's marriages may have made a whole lot of political sense, but spiritually they were his undoing, and they brought him to ruin, and his children suffered as a result. And so those are all the points that I want to make here. We could go further, I know, but I think that'll do for now. And we'll return to this point when we get to 1 Kings chapter 11. So now let's talk about these high places. Did you catch that as we were reading in there in verse 4? This is something that comes up repeatedly in the book of Kings, and that the author is concerned with. And in this context, in 1 Kings 3 and verse 4, it is not mentioned. It's not wholly ambiguous, right? Because the author is saying, Solomon did this. He loved the Lord, verse 3, and he was walking the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So it's not like this outright condemnation, but the implication is this is a mark against him. He did this, except he sacrificed on the high places. So what does that mean? Why were the people and Solomon specifically sacrificing on these high places? Because when you look into Old Covenant law in places like Leviticus 17:3 and 4, and other places, and even throughout Kings, as I mentioned a moment ago, the author, he mentions this a number of times, but it's not. It's usually in a heavy-handed sense. So it's what I mean by that is, as we move through 1st and 2nd Kings, remember the author is kind of using three criterion to evaluate these kings as to whether they're faithful or unfaithful, and one of those is idolatry and how they responded to idolatrous practices, and certainly sacrificing on the altars of the high places was considered to be idolatrous, and it wasn't what God wanted. And Leviticus 17:3 and 4 teaches that, and also in Deuteronomy, I can't put my finger on the verse right now, but the Israelites were commanded to tear down those Asherah poles, all the altars in the high places, God says, because they're in the land previously occupied by the Canaanites, and so those are the places that the Canaanites used on the hilltops and other elevations, or whatever the case may have been. The Canaanites used those places in their idolatrous worship, because they thought that, well, the closer we get to the sky, the more likely my prayers are going to be heard, and my offering is going to reach whatever idol I'm worshiping. But offering sacrifices at places other than the tabernacle was prohibited. Now that's pretty clear again in Leviticus 17:3 through 4. In fact, God says anybody who sacrifices anything except at the tabernacle, he is to be cut off from the people. So this was something that God took very seriously, and it's in the law here. And so what does this mean? How is Solomon painted in this kind of favorable light and an acceptable light, but at the same time, the author is clearly taking exception to this, because he says he did these things. So it was a practice that was, as I understand it, was a practice that was commonly observed in Israel at this time. And there's a reason for this. Remember, and if you go over to 2 Chronicles, I think this gives us a better picture. So let's go to 2 Chronicles for just a moment, chapter 1, because this account of what the King's writer is talking about goes into a little more detail and helps us understand what may be going on. here at this time. Remember that the temple hadn't been built yet, but the tabernacle was still intact, and it was in the wilderness. But let's just go to 2 Chronicles chapter 1 for just a moment and read verses 2 through 6. So Solomon spoke to all Israel, to the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, and to the judges, and to every leader in all Israel, the heads of the fathers' households. And then Solomon and all the assembly went with him to the high place, which was at Gibeon, for God's tent of meeting was there, which Moses the servant of the Lord had made in the wilderness. However, David had brought up the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim to the place he had prepared for it, and he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. Now the bronze altar which Bezalel the son of Uri the son of Hur had made was there before the tabernacle of the Lord, and Solomon and the assembly sought it out. And then Solomon went up there before the Lord to the bronze altar which was at the tent of meeting, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. And in that night God appeared to Solomon and said, "Ask, and I shall give you." So here's what's happening. I think in Kings we just get kind of a brief mention of this worship at Gibeon, and then we move on to Solomon's dream. But here we see a whole lot more detail, and this difference shows a purpose. 2 Chronicles is focusing on the faithfulness to the worship of the Lord, whereas I think the King's author was focusing on Solomon's character. But here we see that it's the tabernacle that's at Gibeon, and David, remember previously, as the text says, he had brought the ark of God to Jerusalem, and so the ark was supposed to be kept in the tabernacle, right? But now you have this tent in Jerusalem with the ark in it, apparently, because David, remember, he intended to build a house for God. He wanted to build this temple, and he gathered the materials. But the tabernacle and the bronze altar and other elements of the tabernacle worship and the tabernacle itself apparently were in the wilderness at Gibeon. And so you have this, kind of split, I don't know what you would call it, but it's not split worship. But it's not that Solomon is going up here to this high place to worship idols, right? He's seeking out, the bronze altar, and he's wanting to worship God, even though it's in this place and the ark of God is not there, and it's just this kind of weird transitional period. And so I think what we see in Kings is that, and in Chronicles here, is obviously that Solomon's worship was accepted and condoned, although it was not strictly lawful and right, because God intended, obviously, for the ark to be in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, and permitted David to take it to Jerusalem. And of course that brought about its own tragedy with Uzzah that we read in 2 Samuel 6. So the best I can do to explain and understand is that this was just simply something God winked at, and he let it be acceptable, even though his tabernacle was basically split in two places. But given the role that the high places will play, throughout the rest of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, that they're going to be devoted to idolatrous worship, I think that the writer is noticing this as kind of a still a mark against Solomon early on, that he didn't bring everything together, even though such worship clearly wasn't sinful. God accepted it. And this seems to fit also kind of a larger trend that the author is following with Solomon, in that, we have something good said about Solomon, and then it's kind of countered with a fault that Solomon has. So, from the beginning in chapter 1, we see, obviously, Solomon was chosen by God, and he's David's heir, and we get this, wonderful speech from David and this charge from David to his son. But then Solomon consolidates his power by manipulating circumstances and kind of putting these restrictions on these people that would ultimately lead to their executions, and that's what happens. And then you see Nathan supporting him in chapter 1 and helping Bathsheba and David bring about Solomon on the throne. But then nothing else is said about him for the rest of Solomon's reign. It's like his voice just disappears. And then we get, later in chapter 3, as we're going to read, with this prayer for wisdom and to rule righteously. But then, we see kind of this hoarding of wealth unjustly and forced labor, and these were things, remember, that Deuteronomy 17 specifically prohibited. And then the completion and dedication of the temple. But then right after that, we see the epithet of Solomon and the foreign wives that he had accumulated to himself, leading him into idolatry, and how the Lord initially supports him early on in chapter 9, but then at the end of his life, God rejects him. So it's kind of this give and take all throughout Solomon's reign. It's this back and forth, and it's tragic. It's tragic because here's the chosen son of David, who had so much wisdom and did so much good and had all these high points, but ultimately chose unfaithfulness. So I think that therein is a warning for us, that this back and forth, that we can't follow that same trend that Solomon did. We have to be wholly dedicated to God and seek Him out on His terms. And the next thing we're going to see is Solomon's prayer for wisdom. So here's one of these high points again. So he's, as we saw in the early part of chapter 3 and then in the Chronicles account, he's worshiping, and God accepts these thousands of sacrifices, and God comes to Solomon in a vision. He says, "Ask whatever you want, and I will ask what you wish of me, and I will give it to you." And then Solomon said, verse 6 of chapter 3, 1 Kings, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you, and you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have shown him a son, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is to this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people, who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" And so this is, a tremendous example for us. Here is a heart that is, surrendered to God, and God wanted to do something. God sees this. He recognizes Solomon's worshipfulness. He recognizes Solomon's desire. Verse 10 says, "Immediately it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing." And so we can know that Solomon was accepted at this point, and that his heart was right before God. And we see what a tremendous blessing. Solomon will have something said about him that's only said, I think, about two other kings in the Old Covenant record. And it's in verse 12 is the phrase that I'm thinking of. He says, "I have done according to your words." This is God's response to Solomon. He says, "Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you." And that particular phrase, "no one like you from before and no one like you afterwards," is used of Hezekiah, and it's also used of Josiah. And we think, well, how could that be the case? Well, in each king's case, it's one particular trait that's singled out here. So here it's Solomon's wisdom, his wise and discerning heart. No other king would have that in the same capacity that Solomon would. In Hezekiah's case, it was the trust that he exhibited in God, and in Josiah's case, it was his obedience, and just the hardcore determination and dedication he had to tear down all those idolatrous places. And he kind of held the sword out over people, because Jeremiah and I think it was Zephaniah, I can't remember if it was Zephaniah or Zechariah, who was a contemporary of Jeremiah in Josiah's time. But Jeremiah and the other prophet don't mention the people's faithfulness, just the opposite. But Josiah is remembered for his incredible obedience and determination. So anyway, I kind of got off track there. But in this instance, Solomon is one of those standout examples. I mean, there's only two other kings in which this phrase is used of them in a different capacity, of course, but here with his wisdom. And of course, in the New Testament, our King and the new covenant is greater than all of them. And so these words in verse 12 are limited to the humans that would come all the way at least up until Christ, because Jesus says that something greater than Solomon is here, and he is referring to himself when he said that. So Solomon here, again, it's a high point. He's praying for this wisdom, and God says it's going to be given to you. I've granted you this request, and because you haven't asked for yourself long life or riches, I'm going to give you these things as well. If you walk in my ways and you keep my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. All right, so there's the long life. Verse 15, Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and made peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. And so, here he is again in verse 15. I think that shows some of that kind of weird transitional period where, he's offering burnt offerings and sacrifices in the high place at Gibeon because the tabernacle's there and the bronze altar and these other trappings. But, he comes back to Jerusalem where the ark is, and he's doing the same thing there. And the Levitical law said, anywhere outside the camp is forbidden. So this is a strange time, but nevertheless, God accepted this worship. And we might read these, this incredible promise and this thing that is said about Solomon with regard to his wisdom and the blessings that he could potentially enjoy that ultimately he forsook. And wonder why. I wish that we had such a promise. And the truth is, remember the new covenant is founded upon better promises than the old. We do have these promises. Right? Jesus, Matthew chapter 7 and verse 7 says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. And what about James? In James chapter 1, you probably know where I'm going with this. In Solomon's prayer for wisdom. But James says, in James chapter 1, in verse 5, he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So we have even greater promises, the same and better than what Solomon had. John 15:7, here's one of the verses I have on the screen. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, Jesus says, you will ask what you desire and it shall be done for you. 1 John 5:14, this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. Right? Psalm 37 and verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Now, we have to understand, these other passages help us understand Psalm 37 and verse 4 because, we're not talking about, and in 1 Kings 3, we're not talking about, picturing God as, this kind of cosmic vending machine where, you just pull the lever, and I want, I want a jackpot, and he just gives you whatever you want. No, the request is informed by the desire, and the desires have to be shaped by a true love for God, as it was in Solomon's case, right? So Solomon, he was at this point in his life desiring something that was pleasing to God, right? In 1 Kings 3:10, that's what it says, and so God grants him this request. So to delight in God is as much a privilege as it is a duty. If we're truly seeking Him and happiness in Him, His favor and His grace and His love and His friendship and fellowship with Him, then we can expect our hearts to be satisfied, right? So neither Solomon or David or any other faithful person, when they pray a prayer like Solomon does here, they're not seeking carnal desire or worldly desires. Right, that's the point. It's not like God will give you those desires if that's what your heart seeks. But if your delight is in Him, and you want again fellowship with Him and the spiritual blessings that only He can impart, then He's gonna grant those things, provided again that we're seeking Him on His terms. And so David in Psalm 37, he's speaking of the real innermost desire of someone who delights in God. That is to be one with Him and have fellowship with Him, and not seek pleasure in the shallow things of the world, which Solomon ultimately eventually did, and all his wives and concubines and riches and so on and so forth. That only yielded disappointment, and it turned him in, he died an old fool. But the one who is expecting peace and happiness and joy from God and seeks it in him, that's the one who's going to be wholly satisfied. And so only those who desire to remove unrighteousness far from them and cease pursuing their own pleasure, they're the ones who are going to find delight and joy in the Lord. And that's initially how Solomon started. And he starts off strong. But the promise remains. Even that verse in James chapter 1 and verse 5 that we read, if you read the larger context of James, he talks about asking amiss. He says, you ask and you don't receive. And he says, why? Because you ask amiss so that you can spend what you get on your own pleasures. All right, so it's, wisdom is something that we should pray specifically for, and James says God will grant it, but also we have to be people of faith. Let him who asks ask in faith without any doubting, because the one who doubts is like a ship tossed by the sea. He shouldn't expect to get anything, James says. So we can have confidence before God, and we should have confidence before God that he will grant us this request, but we have to at the same time evaluate ourselves and test ourselves to see, well, what do I really desire? Right? God already knows the answer, of course, but we have to evaluate ourselves, because that's going to inform our prayers. Right? God is not just looking at the content of what we say, but also the why, or the reason behind we say it, the reason why we say it. All right, and that's what James is pointing out to. You're asking amiss, because it had everything to do with their motivation. And I think, too, what we see here is, in this text, is how wisdom and leadership go hand in hand, and how wisdom is really critical to leadership. And Solomon understood this, and that's why he prays this prayer: "Give your servant an understanding heart, so that he can rule this great people of yours, so that he can be just and discern good from evil." Right, and when we look into the New Testament, of course, that's something that all Christians should desire. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14 tells us we need to be familiar with the Word, so that we can, by implication, I'm paraphrasing here, the Hebrew writer states it in a negative, but I'm going to state it in a positive, that we need to be familiar with the Word so that we can recognize sin and discern, have our senses trained to discern good and evil. And that's essentially what Solomon is asking for here, this kind of discernment, so that he can implement that in being a just ruler and exercising justice and handing out justice, as the example follows later in the chapter with the two women who bring the baby before him. But this is what he's praying for. And then when we look in the New Testament, as I mentioned, it's something all Christians should desire, is this heart of wisdom and discernment. But also specifically leaders, when we look at qualifications for elders, this isn't something that is specifically said in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus chapter 1, where we see those qualifications for elders or shepherds of a local church. But in Titus chapter 1, verses 9 and 11, we do see that they have to be, well, in 1 Timothy 3, they have to be able to teach, and then in Titus chapter 1 and verse 9, they have to be able to rebuke and correct with all authority, because Solomon will say a couple of verses later in verse 11, there's mouths of people who need to be stopped, who just need to be shut up, in other words. But it takes a knowledgeable, wise, and discerning person who is capable in the Word of God in order to do that, right? And so, as I said, wisdom, quote unquote, the qualification in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 is not, quote, he must be wise, but, given the biblical definition of wisdom, which begins with the fear of the Lord, which means a respect for him and his truth, right? That is what we have to see in ourselves as God's people, but especially our leaders. They have to be exemplary in that regard, so that, in practical terms, they can dole out justice and be sentinels of the truth, and guard God's people against error and those who would take advantage of them. So, wisdom and leadership go hand in hand. Wisdom is critical to being an effective leader. In Ephesians 1:18, Paul prayed for Christians. He said, I pray that the eyes of your understanding be enlightened. And again, this is what we see in Solomon. He knows this is a key component here. He wants discernment and the courage to use it. And this was pleasing to God. And it still is. He hasn't changed. He wants his people to desire wisdom. So Solomon, gets that. God not only answers Solomon's prayer, but he answered it beyond all expectation. And that is, I believe, what James is telling us too, is that he says God gives generously to all without reproach, but we have to really desire it more than riches, more than honor, more than long life. We have to desire to be wise in God's eyes, and to seek the wisdom that only He can offer. Moses prayed, and I think it's in Psalm 90. He says he prayed also, please give us a heart of, please teach us to number our days so that we can present to you a heart of wisdom. Right, and so that's another way of asking or praying for wisdom, I believe, to have that eternal perspective, and to maintain that kind of perspective on life. And Paul echoes, a similar idea in Ephesians 3:20 again. He says, as he's praying to God, he's honoring God. He says, now to Him who is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all that we ask or think. Right, and that's exactly what Solomon experienced. And Paul is saying the same is true for New Covenant Christians too. And then this is shown in 1 Kings chapter 3. That an example of this is shown in Solomon displaying this judgment for these women who come to him. Remember the story. It begins in verse 16. It says that they were prostitutes in the New American Standard, but the word can also mean innkeeper. It's translated that way also in the Bible. But anyway, these two ladies come to him, and one woman said, "My Lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child, and she also gave birth to a child sometime later, and this woman's son, verse 19, died in the night because she lay on it, and then she got up and gave me her dead son and put him in my bosom and took my one that was alive. And I rose in the morning to nurse my son. Behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him carefully, and I noticed that he was not the son that I had born." Verse 22, the other woman said, "No, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son." And the first woman said, "No, the dead one is your son, and the living one is mine." And so they're arguing before the king, and the king said, then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son,' the living one is your son." And so he says, "What am I to do with this?" Verse 24, the king said, "Get me a sword." So they brought a sword before the king, and he says, "Divide the living child in two and give half to the other, one half to one and the half to the other." And the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "He shall neither be mine nor yours, divide him." And then the king said, "Give the first one the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother." And when all Israel heard the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. And so this had an impression upon people. So we see Solomon's wisdom illustrated here in this account, but also we see the effect of it. Right? This what happened was soon known throughout all of Israel. This kind of wisdom could not be hidden. Now, obviously, Solomon was a public figure; he was a king. But I believe the same is true today. Jesus said, "Wisdom is vindicated, or proved, or justified by her children," in Luke 7:35. Right, and what we see the response in the people is that they fear the king, or they had great reverence for the king. They see the wisdom of God that was in him, and so they know this is a man who has God with him. He has both the wisdom and courage to do the right thing also as a leader. And this made them hesitant to disobey the law of the king. James tells us that those who are wise and understanding prove themselves by their deeds. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him prove so by the deeds done in the gentleness of wisdom, in James 3:13. And so there was no need for Solomon to boast about himself or honor himself among his people, and certainly not with God. His wisdom was from God. But nevertheless, in exercising this wisdom given by God in humility and in godliness, it had an effect on people. And so it wasn't just for Solomon's benefit. It was for all the world, really. I mean, people from all over the world would come to see Solomon. And Paul tells us, through the Ephesians, Paul tells the church at Ephesus that the manifold wisdom of God is shown through the church. And so let's focus on practicing heavenly wisdom, which James says in James 3:17, it's full of good fruits. And other people may praise us, and that's a good thing, but we're not ultimately seeking to please men or the applause of men. We're ultimately seeking to be pleasing to God and conduct ourselves with wisdom before Him. And that will in turn affect others, and all the more if we were in a leadership position, right? Conduct yourselves with wisdom, redeeming the time. Conduct yourself with wisdom toward outsiders, considering how to respond to them in each moment. And Paul is specifically talking about unbelievers in that text. Again, in 1 Corinthians 14, as in an assembly, as things are done, all things are done properly in order, and all things are done to edification, and genuine truth, biblical truth, teaching and wisdom is imparted in a Bible class or in a sermon or lesson, whatever the case may be. Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 14 that an unbeliever who comes in and there is much prophesying done, in other words, speaking the truth, if that's done, that unbeliever is going to be called to account by all, right? So we're all participating in this. And he says, he will say, truly God is among you. So think about that effect that the wisdom of God has on people, on unbelievers, as the wisdom of God is prayed for and seized upon and practiced by His own people. So do we desire to have that kind of wisdom and discernment? It all comes from one place, in one source, and Solomon understood that. Do we pray for it? Well, I appreciate you tuning in. We're going to end right there, and I hope to see you again soon in the flesh and study these things together. Please feel free to email me with any comments or questions you have. I know that this was our Wednesday night class, and this is a different format. You just have to hear my voice, and we don't have much. There's no discussion, obviously, but we can pursue that in other ways. And I'm anxious to hear from you, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much.